God damn the Queen. There was lots of uniforms about. They were just everywhere, on every street, at every corner. Some of them stopped Malice and searched the cloth bag he carried over his shoulder. It amused Malice. It gave him a touch of nostalgia for Belfast in the 70s and 80s. But this was Dublin 2010, and the occasion was the Queen of England's visit. Of course, uniforms didn't have guns, unless you checked the rooftops. And they didn't have English accents either, but it was still an occupied city. Uniforms swamped the streets in an effort to police the populace. Malice had always been impressed by the name of the state security forces in the so-called Republic. They weren't called the police because they weren't there to police the people. They were called guards because they were there to guard the peace. It was like a trick, a linguistic sleight of hand. Malice had arranged to meet the Catholic worker group at the Four Courts. He was a long-time confirmed agnostic with no love for the name Catholic, and normally would have distanced himself from any connection with the name. But for Malice, the actions of the Catholic worker group, they helped the poor and the homeless, they defended the defenceless. Many of them did hard time in prisons for direct, non-violent actions against brutal, uncaring corporations and empires. For Malice, these actions overshadowed even the horrible connotations their name carried. And here they were, about a half a dozen of them, stood in a row up against the wall of the Four Courts, a bit like a police lineup. They held placards in front of them. Holy mushrooms. Some of the placards were those old iconic images of the Virgin fucking Mary. Holy smoke, it was embarrassing. There was police there, of course, and on this occasion a camera crew. The camera crew took Kieran O'Reilly outside to interview him. Seeing Malice, Kieran handed him a placard and joked, "Come on, you, stand in line. Yo, Pat, up against the wall." Malice joked back and took his placard and stood with the rest of them. Thankfully, Malice's placard had no religious connotations. It was an image of Giuseppe Conlon. Giuseppe had gone to England to lend support to his son who had been framed for a bombing in England, and Giuseppe had consequently been framed himself. Eventually, Her Majesty's judicial system would acknowledge the injustice of Jerry Conlon's incarceration and release him, but not before his father, Giuseppe, had died in one of Her Majesty's prisons. Malice's placard told the story of Giuseppe and asked people to remember Giuseppe and all innocent victims of empire. On closer inspection, even some of the religious images had decent messages. One picture of the Virgin Mary had the words "single mother," "refugee," "role model for a revolutionary," which Malice had to admit tickled him. So they stood against the wall and Joe Black sang a song, the Giuseppe Conlon song. After the song, they moved round the corner and Kieran introduced them all, even though most of them had met before. Joe Black was a singer-songwriter who had supported Kieran and others during some of their previous trials. Malice was introduced as having been brought up in the north during the war. Ben Griffin was a British soldier who had served in Iraq, but whose conscience prevented him from doing a second tour of duty. Kevin was a teacher whose South American wife was about to give birth to her second child, possibly that night. Mick O'Reilly was Kieran's brother. Colin Roddy was an anti-war activist of long standing. Dave was a collaborator who had a small camera and filmed it all. Joe Black and Malice stood to his side and had a fag as the other said a decade of the rosary. Dave, the cameraman, kept the camera running. Colin led the decade in Irish, and most of the others answered in English. After their prayers, the group moved off along the quays in single file carrying their placards in front of them. Their next stop was some church-like building, some kind of a refuge for the destitute. Joe sang another song. She was a wild thing, fine as a bee's wing, and I miss her more than any words can say. Malice thought of an English girl he had once known, how the years would have robbed her taunt skin. Perhaps she was dead and had no skin at all. After another decade of the rosary, they moved on to Dublin Castle. seen of so much torture and murder in its day. Ben read out a little piece he had recalled from his tour of duty in Iraq about flying into villages, bursting into homes, grabbing all the meals, binding their hands, blindfolding them and gagging them. Some of them would piss themselves, some of them would cry. Then they would be handed over to the Yanks for questioning. Read torture. Then Ben and the rest of his Special Air Service group would sit and eat bacon buddies while looking at the River Tigris. A poignant piece. Another song, another decade, and then a single file procession with the placards. They stopped at Phil Lynnett's statue next, and Joe, who had actually known Phil, sang about riding over the Cork and Kerry Mountains and coming on Captain Farrell. They all sang along with the chorus. Manus let his own voice rip. A lot of frustration, violence and aggression came out with Manus's voice. It didn't seem appropriate for such a peaceful group, but he couldn't help it. He had to let it out. And another decade, and they were off again. They had to make a funny sight, the single file procession. Kieran with his dreadlocks down to his bum. No longer a young man, perhaps late 40s, early 50s. Kieran had made his first official protest against the injustices of the British Empire when he was 10 years old, and the Queen of England had come to Australia, where Kieran had been born to Irish parents. The Australian government was celebrating its jubilee or something. The Aboriginal people, those who hadn't been slaughtered, were now treated in a despicable manner, and Kieran thought that to celebrate the slaughter of the Aborigines and the successful colonisation of Australia was disgusting. Instead of waving his little Union Jack, Kieran had turned up with a t-shirt which read IRA. He had been expelled from school for that. 4 decades later, Kieran hadn't changed his attitudes. Their next stop was one of Ireland's aviation fuel offices. The aviation fuel business made millions out of the war in Iraq. Thousands of people died, but the aviation business was booming. Colm did some speaking there. He was joking with Manus beforehand that he hadn't a clue what to say. Colm was another absolute winner as far as Manus was concerned. Colm had to be in his 60s at least. He used to kneel outside the Dáil, dressed in an orange jumpsuit and protest against the treatment of prisoners in Guantanamo Bay and Ireland's collusion in the war. He spoke about the banks and their irresponsible pursuit of profit, and how, when they had bankrupted the country, instead of being imprisoned, their head honchos received millions in golden handshakes before they retired. As he was speaking, some kid was being arrested behind him. The guards had the young boy in a doorway. They had his face pressed against the glass front. They had his hands cuffed behind his back. Thieves, robbers, petty little criminals were only imitating their rulers and masters, but they didn't get golden handshakes when they were caught. They just went to prison. Joe sang another song. War. What is it good for? Absolutely nothing. Another decade, another fag. The next stop was Jim Larkin's statue. Larkin was an internationalist rather than a nationalist. Kieran talked about Larkin and Connolly. Connolly, who had said of bowing down to royalty, that you were also bowing down to your economic masters. Larkin was once smuggled into Dublin to address a crowd from the very balcony that still stands opposite Larkin's statue today. That time the street was crowded, packed to full capacity and more, with people up lampposts and on top of windowsills. The police, had run amok through the crowd back then. They named it Bloody Sunday. More than 500 injured, only 2 dead. Joe sang another song. The Catholic workers said another decade of the Rosary. They had intended to go to the Garden of Remembrance, but it was all cordoned off, so they did their little bit of theatre instead. Kieran said the media had asked him if he was against this royal visit, and he had answered something like he was against all types of royalty, from the Middle Eastern royalties to the British to the heads of large corporate empires. And there was another song, another decade, and they paraded round to the maternity hospital. Apart from costing the Irish taxpayer between 20 and 30 million For extra security, the Queen's visit also caused 500 pregnant women to have their appointments postponed. Another song, another decade. They got some positive responses from people as they walked through the streets, and some negative ones. But mostly Manus figured people hardly noticed. All people cared about was how much money they could get and how many commodities they could buy and consume. They jeered and spat at Jesus Christ. They jeered and spat at the leaders of the 1916 revolution. They would jeer and spit at the Catholic workers. With so many benefits to belonging to an empire, it was only on its fringes that its vicious brutality was clearly visible. If you were quiet and showed no sedition, you would be free to buy Coca-Cola or Pepsi, McDonald's and Nike. And who won the football and who won X Factor and who won American Gladiator? And thank God we live in our free world with our free press and our democracy. And who cares how many thousand died at the hands of Her Majesty's forces in Iraq or Afghanistan or wherever they go to next? It's naive and childish and embarrassing to point out the slaughter these empires reap in their quest for world domination. We're a nice, friendly, neutral country. Shit, the Irish are so neutral, they didn't even take sides against Hitler. Now, most of the Yankee troops who fly to combat fly through this once super neutral country. For the 4,000 Yankee troops so far that got flown back in plastic bags, Shannon Airport was their last living sight of the civilized West. But let's not dwell on irritating embarrassments. We're good little colonised paddies. We would never want to embarrass our economic masters. Cod mila fáilte to your dollars. Who cares about the poor or the weak? Manus always had problems with religions, gods and demons. When you consider a huge flaming ball of gas cooling down on the crust, the incredible violence of the climatic changes, and the millions of years of evolution that had preceded his species on this small speck of dirt in this very large universe, he found the notion of a god rather remote. But for Manus, if there was a god, she would definitely damn the Supreme Commander of the British Armed Forces. She would damn the Queen or King of England.